Hi, welcome to my presentation. Please excuse my voice. I am still a little bit sick from Thanksgiving break. But this presentation will be about violence in South Africa between 1960 and 2000. So, a little overview of the research. The goal of the paper is to research in detail the nuances of the violence that occurred in South Africa between the years of 1960 and 2000. The primary reason I chose this topic is because I want to understand apartheid or apartheid in South Africa. Now, what is apartheid or apartheid? Apartheid, or apartness in the African language, was a system of legislation that upheld segregation against non-white citizens of South Africa. After the National Party gained power in South Africa in 1948, its all-white government immediately began enforcing existing policies of racial segregation. Under apartheid, non-white South Africans, a majority of the population, were forced to live in separate areas from whites and use separate public facilities. My argument in this paper I will be trying to make is that in the case of South Africa, apartheid is the underlying primary cause of all violence within the nation during these 4 decades. First event I'd like to talk about is the Sharpeville Massacre. On the 21st of March 1960, at the police station located in the town of Sharpeville, the police would open fire on a crowd of around 7,000 protesters, killing 69 and injuring 180, with the victims including women and children. This event caused an uproar among the black South African population, and immediately after the massacre, demonstration marches and strikes and riots broke out all over the country. Things had in fact gotten so bad that the South African government had to declare a state of emergency. The government also targeted leaders in their arrests and detainment sprees after the event, which further worsened the issue and their image. Now, ripple effects of the massacre. Like I said, this event caused an uproar among the black South African population, but it had also discredited the South African government on the international stage. A few years after the massacre, I believe it was 2 years, the UN organization would pass Resolution 134, which stated that South Africa's government and policies were a threat to international peace. Now, in order to understand the pattern of violence in South Africa, we have to understand the patterns of violence in Africa as a whole. For that, I researched trends in African conflicts, which I got from a paper from Chapman University. Now, a large number of political conflicts and civil wars seem to be breaking out on the African continent, and in the years leading up to now, it has attracted a reputation of being a hotbed of violence and warfare. Conflict and violence in Africa are a complex subject, especially in South Africa, but it's important to note trends seen in African civil violence as a whole, and speculate on common explanations and misconceptions, in order to find the truth behind the violence within the Republic of South Africa in particular. Now, firstly, contrary to the popular belief shared by many Westerners that violence grips the African continent, you might be surprised to hear that violent civil conflicts are quite rare in Africa. Practically all of Africa's states had their borders drawn by colonial powers and today contain substantial ethnic minority groups. And many African countries have improved since their independence to the present day, and have not collapsed into civil war, despite having extreme religious and ethnic diversity. Second, internal conflict like civil war is somewhat more common among African states than in some other parts of the world, but it is worth noting that since their independence, there have been very few wars between African states themselves. It is actually much more likely that rebels and government militias will cause most armed conflicts on the continent. Every so often, though, there is an exception, such as in 1998 when Ethiopia and Eritrea were at war. The reason for there being such little conflict between African countries can be attributed to the continued success of the Organization of African Unity, which has been very effective in creating a strong policy of what they call non-interference between African countries regarding their individual internal affairs. This policy has time and time again prevented cross-border conflicts from escalating between African countries, and as a result of the efforts of these organizations, most borders in Africa are thousands of miles long, undefended, and unmilitarized. However, the undefended borders themselves have their own problems, such as unrestricted travel, which makes things like smuggling impossible to police in Africa. Third, since the 50 or so states of Africa are quite varied and diverse, it is important to recognize that they have significantly different patterns of civil violence. Africa has been home to wars of decolonization, secessionist struggles, simple criminal acts, coordinated mass murder by state authorities, and anarchic state failure. It is easy to generalize broadly based on the face value of a single country, but the experiences of most, if not all, African countries are entirely unique. Some have had long-running civil wars, and others have fallen into anarchy because of government corruption. Now, what are some standard explanations for violence in Africa? First is ethnic differences. Many people believe that underlying ethnic differences in Africa are the source of its domestic instability and conflict. This theory relates to the fact that rebel groups, in addition to political parties, are all organized based around clan, tribal, ethnic lines, and politicians or leaders often play upon ethnic differences to rise to power. And this explanation is, of course, very appealing to journalists, as the grievance is usually blamed on government discrimination or ancient feuds between groups of people. Second theory relates to the event of a so-called failed state, which is defined as a state whose political or economic system has become so weak that the government is no longer in control. And it is no coincidence that most of the world's failed states have emerged from Africa. The reasons for this state, or the failure of a state, can be traced all the way back to the country's colonial legacies. After gaining their independence, the governments of many of these countries only held influence over the country's primary city and had little to no control over the rest of their territory. Without organization, the cities never had the opportunity to prosper, and without outside help, the African government had no idea how to run the country. Improper and poorly funded administrations led to corruption of the courts, police, and governments, which eventually resulted in chaos. In addition, African countries' levels of wealth tend to be low, stagnant, and unequally distributed, and so most state economies are dependent on the export of a few primary commodities. This dependence makes these countries and their economies extremely vulnerable to global economic shocks. Sadly, these sorts of long-term issues cannot be fixed by foreign aid or local governments. Another common explanation for violence in Africa is that poverty and state weakness create very few wealth opportunities, especially in positions of government. And it doesn't help that the government is the minority. This has meant that leaders are often not secure in their positions, and that there were plenty of people wanting to occupy the position of president both inside and outside the country's capital city. The threat usually came from within the government, as data shows there were 70 military coups and 13 presidential assassinations in Africa just within 2 decades between 1916 and 1980. Leaders became fearful of their own militaries, and in response they starved them by cutting funding and making them rely on patronage from the government. This of course backfired, as the military without funding became weak and unprofessional, which caused them to be taken over by rebel groups and insurgents. Many African governments have been overthrown by militias who had taken control of the military. Examples would include countries like Liberia, Somalia, Sierra Leone, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, conclusion of these theories. What can we learn from them? After researching these theories, I can conclude that African countries are increasingly susceptible to civil violence because their colonial and post-independence history has left their governments extraordinarily weak. However, if there is a strong third-party influence and mediation between the ethnic groups, it is very likely that the outcome of any conflict will be peaceful. But, as we have seen, in the absence of a strong government, tensions tend to escalate, such as what happened in the Congo and Somalia. The tension eventually spirals into a cycle of mistrust and fear, which eventually leads to violence. In order to understand the effect apartheid had on groups of people, I researched the KwaZulu-Natal conflict. This conflict struggle lasted 3 decades and was fought between the Inkatha and the African National Congress / United Democratic Front. In the wider context of history, this conflict can be best described as the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was not only a system of segregation, but also a way for white minority to violate the civil rights of black Africans. Under the apartheid system, Africans could only legally own land in zones designated by the government, which were referred to as Bantustans or homelands. These Bantustans were meant to house different ethnic groups and keep them separated. It is important to note that the Bantustans only use 11% of all the land in South Africa, despite being for most of the population. The land picked by the apartheid government for the Bantustans was often the worst land they could find, and the growing population of black Africans forced to live on the land often couldn't provide for themselves since the land was so infertile. The reason the government did this was so they could give the fertile land and resource-rich land to South Africa's white-owned businesses, and in turn profit from the mining and agricultural sectors. They would first give the land to these companies and then use migrants for cheap labor in order to maximize their profits. Now, the relationship between the KwaZulu and Inkatha. KwaZulu was one of the Bantustans in South Africa and was home to a predominantly Zulu culture, as the name would suggest. And surrounding the KwaZulu homeland was Natal. The Zulu make up the largest ethnic group in South Africa and have a long history of being the dominant group, even before the arrival of European colonizers. The Inkatha are slightly more complex, as their identity has changed multiple times before the conflict. The Inkatha have been known as a Zulu culture movement, a black liberation movement, and finally a political party. Now, the Inkatha were originally formed to be a platform for the Zulu people to encourage liberation. The founder of the Inkatha was Chief Buthelezi. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Who, it's also important to note, was the leader of the KwaZulu homeland government at one point. This explains why most members of the KwaZulu government were also members of the Inkatha organization. Now, the struggle for freedom. There were 3 primary groups against the apartheid government. These 3 groups were the Inkatha, the United Democratic Front, and the African National Congress. However, tensions began to rise between the Inkatha and the ANC because the United Democratic Front did not exist at the beginning. Because of a disagreement during a London conference in 1979. These tensions flared until it became a violent conflict between the 2 organizations, with assassinations and violent attacks being carried out on both sides. The conflict ended when the ANC was exiled by South Africa's government, and pseudo disbanded in 1980. Only a year after the London Conference, the Inkatha would see additional opposition in 1983, and this is where the UDF comes in, as they were formed in 1983. The UDF is a coalition of liberation and labor movements, which was meant to have a wide political platform. Since the goals of the UDF reflected those of the ANC in many ways, a lot of people viewed them as having ties to the ANC, which it later shows they actually did. The reason the UDF fought with Inkatha was often because of the more radical nature of the young organization. Inkatha, throughout its history, had been quite conservative and traditional, which upset the UDF, since the UDF believed Inkatha was working with the apartheid government. Despite Inkatha painting themselves as non-violent, their organization was responsible for most of the violent conflicts during the late apartheid period. The conflict between the UDF and Inkatha evolved into a small civil war between the 2 organizations, with no one to support it in its fight against the UDF, Inkatha turned to the apartheid government, who was more than happy to fuel the civil war between the organizations. This alliance essentially confirmed what members of the UDF had already feared, that Inkatha was now working with the government they were created to abolish. This conflict would end in 1990 after South Africa had gained international interest and the ANC had been unbanned or unexiled. The conflict between these anti-apartheid organizations was single-handedly the most violent event to take place during the apartheid period. Now, the end of apartheid. Anti-apartheid groups had existed since the beginning of apartheid, but it wasn't until 1976 where the movement started gaining international awareness. In 1976, thousands of black children located in Soweto would protest a government policy mandating that all classes be taught in African. The government responded to the protest by having the police kill 176 of the protesters and injure well over 1,000 others. The massacre drew more attention to the anti-apartheid activists than the previous couple decades combined. A couple years after the massacre in the early 1980s, the situation in South Africa had become an important issue in the politics of most other countries. Most notable of these countries being both the United States and United Kingdom. Campaigns for economic sanctions against South Africa began to gain steam in Congress, but these policies faced considerable resistance from none other than Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who were leading their respective countries at the time, and both leaders had condemned Nelson Mandela, as well as the ANC, and attempted to have them both recognized as a terrorist and terrorist organization. The best explanation as for why they would do this is because the South African government had already pledged allegiance to the UK and America. And they kind of served as like what's the word? An ally against an ally in the Cold War against pretty much the Russia. Reagan would attempt to abuse the presidential veto and strike down Congress, the Congress's Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, but Congress was able to overrule his decision with a massive 2/3 majority. Passing the act to impose sanctions on South Africa, the UK also placed economic sanctions on South Africa, although to a significantly smaller extent. Alright, the sanctions seemed to have the desired effect as the added economic pressure and the fact that South Africa was at war with 3 other nations at the time resulted in South Africa giving in to many demands that they wouldn't have otherwise. It is also important to note that by this point in the Cold War, which the year was 1989, the Berlin Wall had fell, effectively putting an end to the spread of communism. And because the spread of communism had been halted, South Africa was no longer an important ally to the United States or United Kingdom. Now, conclusion. In conclusion, it is my strong belief that the issue of apartheid is what caused the vast majority of conflict in South Africa between the years of 1760 and 2000. The evidence used to support this theory is gathered from the conflict between the apartheid government and the black Africans of the country, in addition to the struggles and infighting between various anti-apartheid organizations, including the Inkatha, ANC, and UDF. The reason these two conflicts are so important is because, one, it was the mistreatment of protesting black Africans that earned South Africa's international attention, and two, it would be these anti-apartheid organizations who would be responsible for shaping South Africa's political landscape and government after the end of apartheid. The study relates to the issues worldwide, since the trends seen in South Africa over the last 5 decades can be used as an opportunity to educate other governments in Africa. It's helpful since data collection in Africa is so very rare, and many countries still don't realize how important having this data is. Crises often repeat themselves, as we can see with various recessions throughout history. And I believe that maybe by collecting data and sharing it with these other African countries, we can make Africa as a whole a better place for everyone. And the last page is my sources. Back when I was saying, Michael McKenna's research paper from Chapman University is what helped me really get great insight into those three organizations that I mentioned, which were Inkatha, the United Democratic Front, and the African National Congress. And the rest of the information I gathered was mostly from the African History Online website, which has many, many great sources on there, including primary and secondary. Thank you.